The Academy on station floated in the darkness between three star systems. It was a massive structure, built from the combined efforts of 12 different species over 300 years. The founders had dreamed of a place where young minds from across the galaxy could learn together. They believed that if children grew up beside those who were different from them, they would be less likely to fight wars when they became adults. It was a noble idea. Some days, it even worked. Professor had taught at the academy for 40 years. She was which meant she stood about 5 feet tall and was covered in small scales that changed color depending on the light. When she moved through a sunbeam from the station's artificial windows, she seemed to shimmer like a living rainbow. Her students often found this distracting during morning lectures, but she had learned to position herself carefully to minimize the effect. Today she was teaching comparative galactic history, which was her specialty and her passion. The subject required careful handling because history meant different things to different species. What one civilization called a glorious conquest, another called a terrible massacre, had learned over the years to present multiple perspectives without favoring any single one. It was exhausting work, but she believed it mattered. Her classroom was arranged in a semicircle, with seats designed to accommodate bodies of many different shapes and sizes. Some students needed water tanks, others required special lighting. A few could only attend as holographic projections because their physical forms would have been dangerous to the other students. Had memorized every student's name, species, and special requirements within the first week of each semester. She considered this basic professional courtesy. On this particular morning, she had 23 students present. Most of them were paying attention, which was better than average. The topic was the territorial conflicts of the Fourth Expansion, a period of galactic history that had occurred about 200 years ago. It was important material because many of the political tensions in the modern galaxy could be traced back to decisions made during that era. It was also dangerous material because 2 of her students came from species that had been on opposite sides of those conflicts. X sat in the front row as he always did. Which meant he was large, very large. His species had evolved as apex predators on a high-gravity world, and their bodies reflected that heritage. He stood nearly 7 feet tall even when his posture was relaxed. His exoskeleton was thick and dark, almost black, with ridges of natural armor running down his back and arms. His hands ended in claws that could cut through metal, and his face was dominated by compound eyes and mandibles that clicked together when he was agitated. They were not a species that others crossed lightly. Their empire, the Dominion, controlled over 100 star systems. They had earned that territory through conquest, and they maintained it through strength. X came from one of the military caste families, which meant his relatives included generals, admirals, and planetary governors. He had made sure everyone in the class knew this within the first hour of the first day. Did not like X. She tried not to have favorites or least favorites among her students, but she was honest enough with herself to admit that X made this difficult. He interrupted other students. He challenged her authority. He made dismissive comments about species he considered inferior, which seemed to include most of them. She had documented his behavior and submitted 3 formal complaints to the administration, but nothing had changed. The Dominion was a major donor to the Academy. Certain allowances were made. Myra sat on the opposite side of the room from X, as far away as the seating arrangement allowed. She was a species that resembled large insects with delicate wings and multiple limbs. They were not warriors. They were artists, scientists, and philosophers. Their civilization had existed for thousands of years before they ever developed weapons, and they had only done so after first contact with more aggressive species made it necessary. During the Fourth Expansion, they had conquered the home systems. The occupation had lasted for 60 years. It had not been gentle. Myra's grandmother had been born in a labor camp. They had eventually regained their independence, partly through their own resistance efforts, and partly because they had become occupied with other conflicts. The relationship between the 2 species remained tense. They traded with each other now, and they both sent students to places like the academy, but the wounds had not fully healed. Perhaps they never would. Myra was young, even by standards. This was her first year away from her home world. She was quiet in class, rarely speaking unless called upon, but her written work was excellent, had marked her as a student with potential. The other students represented a variety of species. There were 3 like, 2 who attended class from their water tanks, 5 who looked something like tall, thin humanoids with bluish skin, and various others. Each brought their own perspective to the material, their own cultural assumptions, their own blind spots. This was the point of the academy. This was why it existed. And then there was human, which made him unusual at the academy. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community. They had achieved faster-than-light travel only about a century ago, and they were still considered something of an unknown quantity by the older civilizations. They had spread quickly, establishing colonies and trade relationships, but they had not yet fought any major wars with other species. No one was quite sure what to make of them. Physically, humans were not impressive. They were soft, lacking any natural armor or weapons. They were not particularly fast or strong compared to many species. Their senses were limited. They could not see in the dark like the, or hear ultrasonic frequencies like the, or detect electrical fields like the. On paper, they seemed like a species that should have been conquered long ago. But something about humans made other species uneasy. It was hard to explain exactly what. They were persistent in a way that seemed almost pathological. They adapted to environments that should have killed them. They formed bonds with other species, even species that had tried to harm them, with a speed that seemed reckless. And they had a look in their eyes sometimes, a steadiness, that did not match their apparent vulnerability. Had been teaching humans for about 15 years, ever since the first ones had started attending the academy. She had learned not to underestimate them. She had also learned that they were, in their own way, unpredictable, not dangerous exactly, at least not usually, just difficult to fit into her mental categories. Fit the human pattern, which meant he did not fit any pattern at all. He was average height for his species, with dark hair and eyes and a face that most non-humans would have described as unremarkable. He sat near the back of the room, as humans often did, and he took notes on a tablet that looked like it had survived several drops and at least one small fire. He rarely spoke in class, but when he did, his comments were thoughtful. His grades were good but not exceptional. He was polite to everyone, including X, who was polite to no one. Had reviewed file when he joined her class. He was studying engineering, which was a common choice for humans. He had grown up on one of the outer colony worlds, the kind of place where resources were scarce and life was hard. His application essay had mentioned losing family members to a mining accident when he was young. There was nothing in his background that suggested he was special in any way. And yet, had noticed something about that she could not quite name. He watched things, not in a predatory way like the watched things, but in a patient way, like he was waiting for something he knew would eventually arrive. She had seen him sit perfectly still for an entire lecture, barely blinking, his attention fixed on her with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. She had also seen him help other students carry heavy equipment, share his food with anyone who seemed hungry, and spend his free hours volunteering at the station's Refugee Assistance Center. He was kind. That was the word she kept coming back to. He was kind in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if he had decided at some point that kindness was important and he was going to practice it no matter what. Today he sat in his usual spot, tablet in hand, waiting for the lecture to begin. He did not know that this would be the day everything changed. None of them knew. That was how such days worked. Cleared her throat and activated the holographic display at the front of the room. A map of the galaxy appeared, with certain systems highlighted in red. Today, she said, we will discuss the territorial conflicts of the fourth expansion, with a particular focus on the campaign. I want to remind everyone that this is sensitive material. Many of the events we will discuss were tragic. Many of the decisions were controversial. Our goal is to understand what happened and why, not to assign blame or to old grievances." She paused and looked around the room, making sure she had everyone's attention. X's mandibles clicked once, a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been warning. Myra's wings folded against her body, continued taking notes. "Let us begin," said, "with the political situation in the year 2287 by the standard galactic calendar." The lecture proceeded smoothly for about 30 minutes, described the rising tensions between the Dominion and the Confederation, the failed diplomatic negotiations, the border incidents that had escalated into open warfare. She tried to present both sides fairly. They had genuine grievances about trade route access. They had been inflexible in certain negotiations. Neither side was entirely innocent. But as she moved into the details of the war itself, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The conquest of the systems had been swift and brutal. The military had used tactics that, even by the standards of warfare, had been considered excessive. Cities had been destroyed. Populations had been relocated to labor camps. Cultural artifacts had been seized or destroyed. Presented these facts as neutrally as she could, citing sources from both and historians. She noticed that X's posture was changing, his spines rising slightly along his back. She noticed that Myra was trembling. She should have ended the lecture there. She would think about this later, in the quiet of her quarters, and she would wonder if things would have been different if she had simply called for a break. But she did not. She continued. She was a professional. This was important material. Her students needed to understand it. And so she kept talking, and the tension kept building, and the moment of crisis drew closer with every word she spoke. The breaking point came when Myra raised her limb to ask a question. Had just finished describing the establishment of the labor camps on Prime. She had used careful language, drawing from official records that described the camps as relocation centers for population management. She had also cited survivor accounts that described the conditions inside those camps. The contrast between the two sources was stark. Myra's voice was soft when she spoke, could modulate their voices in ways that conveyed emotion directly, and could hear the pain in every word. "Professor," Myra said, "my grandmother was born in one of those camps. She told me stories about what it was like. She said the guards would separate families on purpose, that they would take children away from their parents and never tell anyone where they went. She said the food was barely enough to survive on, and the work was designed to break people down. She said many of her friends died there." Myra paused, her wings quivered. "I understand that we are supposed to study history objectively," she continued. "But I need to ask, why? Why did this happen? They had already surrendered. The war was over. Why did they treat them this way?" It was a fair question. It was a painful question, but it was fair. Opened her mouth to answer. She never got the chance. X surged to his feet. The movement was sudden enough that several students flinched. There was massive even when sitting, but standing, he dominated the room. His thoracic spines rose to their full extension, a display that his species had evolved to intimidate rivals and terrify prey. His compound eyes fixed on Myra with an intensity that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. "You will silence that creature," X said. His voice was loud, harsh, designed to carry across a battlefield. "Or I will silence her myself." The classroom went still. Every student froze. Even the in their tanks stopped moving, their fins going rigid. Felt her scales change color, shifting toward the pale blue that indicated fear. She fought against it, trying to maintain her composure, trying to remember her training. "X," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could. "Please sit down. This kind of behavior is not acceptable in my classroom." "Your classroom," X repeated. He did not sit down. He turned his massive body toward Myra, and his claws extended from their sheaths with a sound like knives being drawn. "Do you know what my ancestors did to creatures like her? Do you know why they were put in those camps?" Myra made a sound. It was a keening noise, high and thin, that her species produced in moments of extreme terror. Her wings pressed flat against her body. Her limbs curled inward, a defensive posture that would do nothing against claws. "They were weak," X continued. He took a step toward Myra's desk. "They were pathetic. They had resources that we needed, and they were too soft to defend them. They should have been grateful that we let any of them survive. My ancestors were merciful. They could have wiped the species from existence, and no one would have stopped them." X moved around her lectern, positioning herself between thee and the student. It was a brave gesture, but it was also futile. She was smaller than Myra. Against X, she would be nothing. "I am ordering you to stand down. If you do not comply immediately, I will call security." "Call them," X said. His mandibles clicked together, a sound like bones snapping. "By the time they arrive, I will have taught this creature the lesson her grandmother should have learned. The weak do not get to question the strong. The conquered do not get to demand explanations from their conquerors." He took another step forward. He was close now, close enough that Myra would have been able to feel the heat radiating from his body. "We're cold-blooded." They were not. To her, he must have seemed like a furnace, a wall of heat and violence and death. The other students were pressed against the walls, trying to get as far away from the confrontation as possible. Some of them were crying. Others were frozen in shock. They whose species had never evolved a fight-or-flight response simply stood in place, their expressions blank, their minds unable to process what was happening. Looked around the room, desperate for help, for anyone who might be able to do something. And she saw. The human had risen from his seat. There was no urgency in the movement. He simply stood up, placed his tablet on his desk, and stepped into the aisle between the rows of seats. Then he began to walk. His pace was unhurried. His expression was calm. His hands hung loosely at his sides. He looked, if anything, like a man taking a casual stroll through a park. He walked past the frozen students. He walked past the trembling. He walked past, who tried to stop him with a hand on his arm, and found that he simply kept moving, gently but firmly, as if she were not there at all. And then he stopped. He stopped in the space between X and Myra, directly in the path that they would have to take to reach the girl. "That's enough," said. His voice was quiet. It was not loud enough to carry across a battlefield. It was barely loud enough to carry across the room, but somehow it was the only sound anyone could hear. X stopped. His claws were still extended. His spines were still raised, but he had stopped. "Move, mammal," he said. Did not move. The moment stretched out, long and thin, like a wire being pulled, and everyone in the room held their breath, felt her heart beating so hard that she thought it might crack her ribs. Stood in the aisle, looking up at a creature that was nearly twice his height and many times his strength, and he did not move. He did not move at all. The silence that followed X's words was unlike anything Professor had ever experienced in her 40 years of teaching. It was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a room full of living beings who had all stopped breathing at the same moment. It was the silence of a moment that could go in any direction. X's compound eyes shifted slightly, focusing on the human who stood in his path. The visual system was designed to track fast-moving prey across great distances. It could detect the slightest twitch of muscle, the smallest shift in weight that might indicate an attack or a retreat. X had used this advantage many times in his life. He knew how to read bodies. He knew how to find fear. He looked at and found nothing. The human stood with his weight evenly distributed on both feet. His shoulders were relaxed. His hands remained loose at his sides, not clenched into fists, not raised in defense. His breathing was slow and regular. His face showed no expression that X could identify as fear or anger or anything else. It was, the realized, as if the human had not noticed that he was in danger. "I said move," X repeated. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them to less than an arm's length. At this range, he could have reached out and torn the human's throat open with a single swipe. He wanted the mammal to understand this. He wanted to see the fear that would inevitably follow understanding. Looked up at him. The human's eyes were dark brown, a color that they associated with soil and decay. They were not impressive eyes. They were not the eyes of a predator. But they did not look away. "No," said, "I don't think I will." Felt something shift in the room. She could not have explained what it was. The air did not change temperature. The light did not dim or brighten. Nothing physical happened at all, but something was different. She had studied humans extensively over the years. She had read papers about their evolution, their history, their psychology. She knew that they came from a world where they had not been the strongest or the fastest predators. They had survived by using tools, by working together, by being clever. They were persistent hunters, which meant they could track prey across great distances without stopping, wearing down animals that could have killed them in a direct confrontation. She also knew something that was not written in any paper. She had learned it from watching humans in her classroom year after year in situations large and small. Humans could be afraid. They often were afraid, but fear did not control them the way it controlled other species. They could feel fear and then do the thing they were afraid of anyway. It was, when she thought about it, one of the most terrifying things she had ever learned about any species. Was afraid. She could see it now if she looked closely. There was a slight tension in his jaw. His pupils were dilated slightly more than the lighting conditions would suggest. His heart rate had probably increased, though she had no way to measure it. But he was not going to move. X saw none of this. They did not have the cultural framework to understand what was happening. In his experience, creatures responded to threats in predictable ways. They fought, which was acceptable and sometimes entertaining. They fled, which was contemptible but natural. They submitted, which was proper and expected. This human was doing none of these things. He was simply standing there, as if the threat did not exist, as if X's claws and strength and fury were irrelevant factors in some equation the human had already solved. It was confusing, and for the confusion was a form of weakness. "Do you understand what I can do to you?" X demanded. He raised one clawed hand, holding it where the human could see it clearly. "I could cut you in half before you had time to scream. Your soft body is no protection against me. Your species has no natural weapons, no armor, nothing. You are prey. You have always been prey." Looked at the claw. He looked back at X's face. "Probably," he agreed. "You could probably do that. Then why are you still standing there?" The human seemed to consider the question. His head tilted slightly, a gesture that had learned to associate with human thoughtfulness. "Because Myra hasn't done anything wrong," said. "She asked a question. That's what students are supposed to do, and you're trying to hurt her for it. She insulted my people. She asked why her grandmother's generation was forced into labor camps. That's not an insult. That's history. We're in a history class." X's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sound that indicated rising agitation. They were defeated. They have no right to question their defeat. They should be grateful they still exist. "I don't think gratitude works that way," said. "I don't think you can beat someone down and then expect them to thank you for it. I think that's just called cruelty." Behind, Myra made a small sound. Could not tell if it was fear or surprise or something else entirely. The swings had stopped trembling. She was watching the human's back with an expression that could not read. X leaned forward, bringing his face close to his. At this distance, the human would have been able to see every detail of this exoskeleton, every sharp edge and lethal point. The X exhaled, and his breath washed over the human's face, hot and smelling of meat. "Last warning, mammal. Move or I will move you. Did not flinch. He did not step back. He did not even blink. I'm not going to do that, he said. If you want to hurt her, you'll have to go through me first. Something changed in X's posture. It was subtle, almost invisible, but caught it. His weight shifted backward slightly. His spines, which had been at full extension, lowered by a fraction of an inch. He was uncertain. The realization hit like a physical blow. She had never seen a uncertain. She had not known they could be uncertain. Their culture was built on absolute confidence, on the unshakable belief that strength determined all outcomes. A who showed uncertainty was a who had already lost. But X was uncertain now. She could see it in the way his eyes moved, scanning the human's body again and again, searching for the threat he knew must be there but could not find. The other students were watching too, saw them, pressed against the walls, their eyes wide. They had all expected to die. They had been waiting for the moment when X's claws would flash forward and end the confrontation in blood. That moment was not coming, and none of them understood why. The truth was something that X would never have admitted, not even to himself in the privacy of his own thoughts. The truth was that he did not know what to do. In his entire life, he had never encountered a situation like this. He had threatened creatures before, many times. They had always responded in ways he could predict. They had fought back and he had defeated them. They had run and he had chased them or let them go depending on his mood. They had submitted and he had accepted their submission. But this human was not doing any of those things. He was just standing there, looking at X with those soft brown eyes and waiting. Waiting for what? X did not know, and because he did not know, he could not act. To strike the human now would be to admit that he had been forced into action by confusion rather than choice. It would be to show weakness in front of the entire class. The silence stretched on, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. Finally, X stepped back. "This lesson is beneath my dignity," he said. His voice was rough, forced. "I will not waste my time on such pathetic creatures." He turned and walked toward the door. His steps were heavy, deliberate, trying to reclaim some of the authority he had lost. He did not look back. The door opened. He walked through it. The door closed behind him. And then he was gone. For a long moment, nobody moved. The students remained pressed against the walls. Professor remained frozen in place. Myra remained huddled in her seat, her wings pulled tight against her body. Turned around. He walked back to Myra's desk and crouched down beside her, putting himself at her eye level. "Are you okay?" he asked. His voice was gentle, concerned. There was no trace of the steadiness that had faced down X. He sounded like what he was, a young man checking on someone who had been frightened. Myra looked at him. Her compound eyes, which had been dull with fear, began to regain some of their usual brightness. "I think so," she said. "I think I'm okay because of you." Shook his head. "I didn't do anything, I just stood there." "Yes," Myra said, "you did." She reached out with one of her delicate limbs and touched his hand. It was a gesture of profound gratitude in culture, an acknowledgement of a debt that could never be fully repaid. Looked embarrassed. "Really," he said, "it wasn't a big deal." But watching from across the room, knew that it was. She had seen something today that she would not forget. She had seen a human stand against not with weapons or threats or superior force, but with something else entirely. She was not sure what to call it. Courage, perhaps, or maybe just stubbornness, or maybe something that did not have a name in any language she knew. The class was dismissed early that day. The students filed out slowly, still processing what they had witnessed. Many of them glanced at as they passed, their expressions a mixture of awe and confusion. Asked to stay behind. She had questions. She had many questions, but when she tried to put them into words, she found that she did not know where to begin. "Mister," she said finally, "what you did today was extremely dangerous." "I know," said. "X could have killed you. I know. Then why did you do it? Was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his hands, which had been so steady when facing X, but were now fidgeting slightly with the strap of his bag. Because someone had to, he said, and nobody else was going to. It was not a complicated answer. It was not a profound answer. But it was, realized, a human answer. She let him go. He walked out of the classroom and disappeared into the corridor, just another student going about his day. But sat at her desk for a long time after he left, thinking about what she had seen and what it meant. She thought about the who had conquered 100 worlds with their strength. She thought about the who had survived 60 years of occupation with their spirit intact. And she thought about the humans, who were new to the galaxy and soft and slow and apparently helpless. She thought about a young man who had stood in front of a monster and said no. And she wondered, not for the first time, what the humans would become. The news of what had happened in Professor classroom spread through the academy within hours. Stories like this always did. By evening, everyone had heard some version of the events, though the details varied depending on who was telling the tale. Some versions said that had revealed a hidden weapon and forced X to back down. Others claimed that he had spoken words of such power that they had been physically unable to continue. A few whispered that he had called upon allies outside the room, perhaps other humans waiting in the corridors with guns. None of these versions were true. The reality was both simpler and harder to explain. Wrote her incident report that evening. She sat at the small desk in her quarters, staring at the blank document on her screen, trying to find the words that would capture what she had witnessed. At approximately 10:42 station time, she began, Student X made verbal threats against Student Myra in response to questions asked during class discussion. When I attempted to intervene, he ignored my instructions and advanced toward the student with apparent intent to cause physical harm. She paused. The next part was the difficult one. At this point, human student positioned himself between X and Myra. He did not make any threatening gestures or statements. He simply refused to move when ordered to do so. After approximately 15 to 20 seconds of direct confrontation, X from the classroom without carrying out his threats. She read what she had written. It was accurate, it was factual, it explained nothing. She added a personal note at the bottom of the report, something she rarely did. In my 40 years of teaching, I have never witnessed a confrontation like the one that occurred today. I have seen students intimidate other species before. I have always seen those other species respond with fear, submission, or retreat. I have never seen anyone simply stand in place and wait. I do not know why his response was effective. I do not know if he understood the risk he was taking or if he simply did not care. I do know that his actions prevented a violent incident that could have resulted in serious injury or death. I am requesting a full disciplinary review of X's behavior. I am also recommending that receive recognition for his actions, though I suspect he will not want it. She submitted the report and closed her terminal. The disciplinary hearing took place 3 days later. Was called to testify, as were several other students who had witnessed the incident. Was called too, though he said very little. When asked to describe what had happened, he simply repeated the facts. X had threatened Myra, had stepped between them, X had eventually left. When asked why he had done it, he gave the same answer he had given, because someone had to. The disciplinary board spent 2 hours in deliberation. The final decision was not unanimous, but it was definitive. X was expelled from the academy, effective immediately. His family's donations would not be returned. His credits would not be transferred. He was escorted from the station that same evening by security officers who seemed nervous despite their armor and weapons. X did not resist. He did not make threats. He simply walked, his massive body moving with mechanical precision, his eyes fixed straight ahead. If he felt shame or anger or anything else, he did not show it. As he passed through the departure gate, he paused for just a moment. He turned his head slightly, scanning the observation deck where students had gathered to watch him leave. His eyes found. The human was standing near the back of the crowd, partially hidden behind a group of students. He was not trying to be noticed. He was just watching, as he always seemed to be watching, with that patient, steady gaze. X stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned away and walked through the gate without a word. He did not look back again. Life at the academy returned to something like normal over the following weeks. Classes resumed. Students attended lectures and submitted assignments and complained about cafeteria food. The incident in his classroom became just another story, told less and less frequently as newer events captured people's attention. Went back to his engineering studies. He attended classes. He took notes on his battered tablet. He helped other students with their homework and volunteered at the refugee center on weekends. He did not talk about what had happened unless someone asked him directly, and even then he seemed uncomfortable with the attention. Myra sought him out a few days after the hearing. She found him in one of the station's observation lounges, sitting alone by a window that looked out on the stars. "May I sit with you?" she asked. "Sure," said. He moved over to make room for her, though there was plenty of space on the bench. They sat in silence for a while, watching the distant lights of ships moving through the void. Myra's species did not have a strong tradition of verbal communication. They were comfortable with quiet in a way that many species were not. "I wanted to thank you," she said finally. "I did not have the chance before. Everything happened so fast." "You don't have to thank me," said. "I know, but I want to." She paused, her wings shifting slightly. "I have been thinking about what you did, trying to understand it." "There's not much to understand. X was going to hurt you. I didn't want him to." "Yes, but why? You did not know me. We had never spoken before that day. I am not your species. I am not even similar to your species. Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" Was quiet for a long moment. He seemed to be thinking about the question seriously, as if he had not considered it before. "I don't know," he said eventually. "I just saw what was happening and I knew I had to do something. It wasn't really a decision. It was more like, I don't know how to explain it. It was just what I was going to do." Myra considered this. In her culture, actions were always the result of careful deliberation. They did not believe in impulse. They believed in thought, in consideration, in weighing consequences before committing to any course of action. But she had seen stand in front of X. She had seen the look in his eyes. There had been no calculation there. There had been no cost-benefit analysis. There had been only certainty. "Your species is strange," she said. It was not an insult. It was simply an observation. "Yeah," agreed. "We get that a lot." They sat together for a while longer, watching the stars. Then Myra returned to her dormitory and returned to whatever he had been doing before she arrived. They would see each other in class after that. They would nod in greeting when they passed in the corridors. They were not close friends. They did not need to be. Something had passed between them in that moment in his classroom, something that did not require words or rituals or ongoing maintenance. It simply was. Continued to teach. She continued to write her reports and submit her complaints and try to maintain order in her classroom. But she added a new section to her personal files, a collection of notes that she had been compiling for years. The section was titled Observations on Humans. She had started it when the first human students arrived at the academy, curious about this new species that seemed so unremarkable on the surface. Over the years, she had added to it whenever she witnessed something that seemed significant. The day after X's expulsion, she added a new entry. "They are not brave because they do not feel fear. They are brave because they have decided that fear is not the point." She thought about this for a long time. Then she added one more line. "I am beginning to understand why so many species watch the humans with such caution. It is not because they are dangerous in the conventional sense. It is because they do not follow the rules that everyone else follows. They do not accept that the strong must always defeat the weak, or that the many must always overwhelm the few, or that fear must always lead to submission. They simply decide what they are going to do, and then they do it. This is, perhaps, the most dangerous thing of all. Years passed. Myra graduated from the academy and returned to her home world, where she began working as a researcher at one of the major universities. Her specialty was galactic history, which surprised no one who had known her as a student. She published papers. She presented at conferences. She earned a reputation as a careful, thorough scholar who brought genuine insight to difficult topics. Her first major work was a comprehensive study of the territorial conflicts of the Fourth Expansion. It took her 5 years to complete. It was published to critical acclaim and became required reading in history courses across dozens of star systems. The dedication page contained only a few words. To MC who stood up. When asked about this dedication in interviews, Myra would simply say that it referred to someone who had helped her during a difficult time in her education. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Finished his engineering degree and left the academy. He took a job with a deep space construction company, helping to build stations and habitats in the outer reaches of explored space. It was hard work, often dangerous, but he seemed to enjoy it. He never sought fame or recognition for what he had done in his classroom. When people asked him about it, he seemed genuinely puzzled by their interest. He had not done anything special, he would say. He had just been there. Someone had needed help. He had helped. It was, he believed, what anyone would have done. But that was not true. Knew it was not true. She had been there. She had seen the other students pressed against the walls, frozen with fear. She had seen the moment when had risen from his seat and walked into the space between predator and prey. Anyone could have done it, but only one person had. The academy on station continued to operate, year after year, generation after generation. Students came and went. Species that had once been enemies learned to work alongside each other. The dream of the founders, the hope that understanding could prevent war, slowly and imperfectly came closer to reality. And in the corridors and classrooms and dormitories of that great station, a story was told. It was not a famous story. It was not taught in history classes or recorded in official documents, but it passed from student to student, class to class, year to year. It was the story of a day when a monster had threatened to harm an innocent person. A day when everyone had been too afraid to act. Everyone except one human who had stood up from his seat and walked forward and said, "That's enough." The story did not always have the same details. Sometimes the human was tall. Sometimes he was short. Sometimes he had weapons hidden in his clothes. Sometimes he had called upon ancient human martial arts to defeat his enemy. The variations were endless. But the core of the story was always the same. A human had faced a monster, not with strength or weapons or superior numbers, but with something else. Something that the storytellers could never quite name but always recognized. They heard this story, and they did not know what to make of it. It did not fit their understanding of how the universe worked. They heard this story, and they remembered their grandparents' stories of resistance during the occupation. They understood something that they did not. Other species heard the story too. They passed it on to their children and their students and their friends. It became part of the informal folklore of the academy, and then of the broader galactic community. And somewhere, in a construction habitat at the edge of explored space, a middle-aged human named continued his work. He did not know that he had become a legend. He probably would not have believed it if someone had told him. He was not a hero. He was just a person who had seen something wrong and had decided to do something about it. It was, he would have said, what anyone would have done. But it was not, and that was the point. That was always the point. The galaxy was vast and old and full of species that had learned a million different ways to survive. Some survived through strength. Some survived through cunning. Some survived through numbers or speed or natural armor. The humans survived through stubbornness. They survived by deciding, over and over again, that they would not accept the rules that everyone else followed. They survived by standing up when they were supposed to stay down. They survived by looking monsters in the eye and saying no. It was not always wise. It was not always successful. Sometimes the humans who stood up were struck down, and their stories ended in tragedy rather than triumph. But sometimes they were not. Sometimes they stood their ground and the monster blinked first, and the story had a different ending. And those stories spread. They took root in the minds of other species, other individuals, other beings who had been taught all their lives that the strong always won and the weak always lost. The humans taught them something different, not through words or arguments or philosophical treatises, through action, through example, through the simple, stubborn refusal to accept that fear had to be the end of the story. This is what the Academy founders had hoped for, though they never could have predicted the form it would take. They had believed that bringing species together would teach them to understand each other. They had been right, but not in the way they expected. The other species did not learn to understand humans. Not really. Humans remained strange and unpredictable and often baffling, even to those who had studied them for decades. But they learned something else. They learned that the rules they had always accepted were not laws of nature. They were choices, and choices could be made differently. A historian dedicated her life's work to a human who had stood between her and harm. A professor added notes to her files about a species that did not let fear make their decisions for them. A warrior walked away from a confrontation he should have won because something in his opponent's eyes made him uncertain. And a human engineer built stations in the darkness between stars, never knowing that he had changed the galaxy simply by standing up when everyone else stayed down. This is the story, not just of though he is part of it, not just of the Academy though it is part of it too. This is the story of what happens when someone decides that fear is not the point. It is not a story that ends. It is a story that continues in every moment when someone sees something wrong and decides to do something about it. In every confrontation where the weak refuse to submit to the strong. In every quiet act of courage that no one else will ever know about. The humans brought this to the galaxy, not intentionally, not even knowingly. It was simply who they were. And the galaxy slowly was changed by it. In her final years of teaching, Professor would sometimes tell her students about the day she had watched a human face down. She did not tell it as a heroic story. She told it as a puzzle, a question for them to consider. Why did he do it? She would ask. He knew he might die. He had no special powers or weapons. He was just one person, small and soft and vulnerable. Why did he stand up? The students would offer various answers: bravery, stupidity, instinct, duty. None of the answers satisfied her because none of them captured the truth. The truth was that it stood up because standing up was what he had decided to do, not because he was not afraid, not because he expected to win, not because he thought he would survive. He had stood up because someone was going to be hurt, and he had decided that this was not acceptable. It was a simple thing. It was a profound thing. It was a human thing. And when her students looked at her with confusion in their eyes, not understanding why this mattered, would simply smile and change the subject. They would understand someday, or they would not. The important thing was that the story continued to be told.